Coming up on this episode of the All Aboard Podcast, we talk about first generation EMD locomotives and their impact on the railroading of today. Have your tickets out of the envelope. All aboard, please. Now boarding on track number 8 is train number 1, the All Aboard Podcast, your twice weekly excursion into transportation excellence, and I am your conductor, Phil Bell, Enterprise B, PB Crisp, Mr. 645, a highly trained rail enthusiast who may yet one day become a highly trained broadcast specialist. And as always, I am blessed to hold the E. Hunter Harrison Chair here at the Bell Institute for Advanced Railroad Studies, where there are no degrees because the learning never ceases. And if it does, then you should go find another podcast. And as always, it is great to be back behind this, the Brunswick Green PLB microphone. So I went through a lot of the episodes that we've done recently, and it occurred to me that we've talked a lot about railroad companies, we've talked about railroad regulation, we've talked about railroad advocacy organizations, we've talked about just about everything except the one thing that made so many people enthusiastic about trains themselves, and that is trains themselves. So I said, hey, look, let's talk about trains. Let's actually talk about trains. And so I figured we should talk about something that is just so evocative, and that is the first generation of Electro-Motive Division locomotives. And when I say that, for those of you who are on CP5 cam, I'm talking about this, and you see that is a Florida East Coast Railway E6, which was built in the 1940s for Henry M. Flagler's Railroad, and of course pulled a lot of famous passenger trains like the Florida Special and the South Wind. Now, why so much discussion and interest in EMD first generation locomotives? Well, that's because the Electro-Motive Division did more than anyone else in order to develop interest in the diesel locomotive and also push steam locomotives off the rails. And this is significant because railroads at the time, as they are today, were large industrial enterprises. And if you've worked in any kind of a large enterprise, you know one of the biggest problems is that they are so unwilling to change. And the crazy part about that is that unwillingness lasts not only to your, stereotypical corporate bureaucrat who just sits there with his green eye shade and doesn't ever want to do anything. It also extends to the people who are highly entrepreneurial but happen to find themselves within a corporate bureaucracy. Now, if you're an outsider, you're never going to know that because you'll be, like me, the entrepreneur who goes there and says, hey, I'd like to do a partnership with you, or would you sell me this business, or would you do that? And their pat answer is no, and sometimes it's hell no, and it's super hell no after that. And so you think, well, they're just a bunch of stuck in the mud mossbacks who don't want anything special to happen. And they don't care about profits, and they're probably a bunch of moral reprobates. That's what goes through your head. But in reality, a lot of it is simply just dealing in the corporate infrastructure. And so when you think about something like a railroad of the 1930s or the 1940s, and we're talking about the New York Central, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, the Norfolk and Western, the Milwaukee Road, the Great Northern, the Northern Pacific, the Gulf Mobile the Gulf Mobile and Northern, the Chicago and Alton, the Mobile and Ohio, and so on. These were very large corporate bureaucracies, and in those days, they were even larger than the railroads of today, simply because so many of the tasks that now we automate through our computers, and that can be anything like making different calculations in a Microsoft Excel document, or doing a document in Microsoft Word, whereas the printer is actually going to print it out, and that way all we have to do is maybe put it in an envelope, if that. So you had a lot more people, and because you have a lot more people, you have a lot more inertia. So that's why it was so special when Electro-Motive, which by this point was part of General Motors, came along and basically said, look, we've got these locomotives. The locomotives are nowhere near as powerful as your steam engines are, and they are going to be better than your steam engines, and we want you to buy them. Now, this is significant on many ways. Number one, it's the fact that they had managed to come up with a way to make this marketable, and this is something that took nearly 2 decades to do. That's number one. Number two, let's also remember who General Motors was. They were not part of the railroad milieu in the way that we thought of them in the 1970s, 1980s, and even into the 1990s. And let's also remember the most important part of any business enterprise actually is not the money, it's the relationships between people who work within the company and also the relationships those people have with those outside of the company. So you think about the major railroad locomotive builders, Alco, the American Locomotive Company, Baldwin Locomotive Works, Lima. All three of those were the big cheeses in terms of supplying locomotives, and they did so almost on an ad hoc basis for each different class and type that were sold to railroads. And then you look at some other carriers, as we mentioned earlier, the Norfolk and Western, the Pennsylvania, who had extensive experience building their own steam locomotives and had a lot of success with that. And also adding in the parts suppliers that helped to provide these, whether it was a company-built locomotive or it was one built by one of those big three manufacturers. All those relationships mattered, and all those relationships were then put at risk when these, as they've been called in various magazines, growlers, showed up. So first of all, let's take a little bit of a walk down memory lane about who is the Electro-Motive Division. Well, it was founded in 1922 by Harold L. Hamilton in Cleveland, Ohio, and it was called the Electro-Motive Engineering Corporation. Now, it did something, it found a way, or I would say a side door, to get into the railroad industry, and that was focusing on the self-propelled rail car. Now, that's what we call doodlebugs, for those of us who are rail fans, and it's kind of a endearing term, but also in some ways it's a little bit of a pejorative term because, yeah, we're going to ride on the doodlebug. It doesn't exactly evoke the same romance and desire as, hey, we're going to ride on the 20th Century Limited with a what's the word I'm looking for? With a Niagara or one of those, very significant steam locomotives pulling them. So this is what they did. And you say, well, Phil, why did they focus on doodlebugs? What was so important about those? Well, the doodlebug was critically important because at the time, which is the 1920s, you saw the beginning of what would be a long-term decline in passenger rail. And this decline started on your branch lines. Why? Because you were starting to see improved roads and you were starting to see automobiles that became a little bit more affordable. Now, if you're watching on CP5 Cam, here is an example. Oh, looks like we got the wrong thing there. Let's see if we can do a little bit better. I guess we can't. And if you know anything about this podcast, you know the number one thing that's always going to happen here is having some kind of technical difficulties. So basically, we're talking about self-propelled rail cars. And self-propelled rail cars, they often had a diesel engine or a gasoline engine in pretty much the middle of the rail car. And you had an operator's cab in the front. And then behind that, you would have perhaps you would have either a combine area, so that would be a area for passengers to ride in, along with a baggage area, or maybe just an area for passengers to ride in. But it usually was a combine of some sort, because the goal of these rail cars was to be able to carry mail, express, light freight, and passengers in the same car. Because if you did this and now you no longer needed a steam locomotive, then you could do a lot more with a lot less. And as this was a declining business, even though you were putting new money into buying this equipment, it also meant you were going to spend a lot less in terms of operating cash. And one of the most difficult things to do then as now is to be able to finance operating deficits. And let's talk about that for a minute. Now, if you go to start a business, you will encounter a lot of hurdles. Or if you have a business that's running, you'll encounter a lot of hurdles, largely because most banks, which are the primary places that you'll get debt capital from, are unwilling to lend for general corporate purposes. Now, the higher that you go up the food chain, the larger you become, the more willing that they will be. So if you happen to be a 5-person business, maybe you're a boutique, and you want to borrow some money for operating cash because you would like to buy a new sign here, you would like to buy some a new counter over there. Maybe you'd like to put down some new carpet and do some advertising. You can go ahead and max out your credit cards, which is what a lot of entrepreneurs will do. But if you go to a bank and say, well, look, we've been in business for 5 years, we'd like to borrow $40,000 to do this, they're still going to give you the side eye, and there is a very good chance the answer will be no, even if you have 5 years of successful operations. If you go with a loan guarantee from someone like the Small Business Administration, it gets to be a lot easier and they're more willing to make the loan. But even with those guarantees, it's not a guarantee that they will make the loan. Well, you got to think about it. A corporation, a larger corporation, even a railroad, and especially those of the 1920s, right after control by the USRA, the United States Railway Administration, ended. And that was where the railroad properties were actually seized by the federal government and operated by the federal government and run into the ground by the federal government, as the railroads themselves will tell you, because everything was in such disrepair after that period of coordinated operation. Saying, okay, well, look, we've got deficits on all of these different routes. We really need to finance them because we have to continue operating the train. Well, when you go in to talk to a financial institution and the first words out of your mouth are deficits, and we're going to finance those, they're getting squeamish already. Now, perhaps that may not have been exactly how they presented it, but that was. But what you can do is you can borrow money collateralized by an asset, either a fixed asset like land, the land under the track, or something like a rail car. And in this case, during the time when railroading was a much larger portion of American industry, it was a lot easier to collateralize those. So for somebody like the Erie Railroad, it was very easy for them to go over and say, okay, well, you know what we're going to do? We will buy this new rail car. And what I was going to show you before our technical difficulties hit was a picture of Erie number 5012, which was an early 1930s era built doodlebug, or self-propelled rail car, as we might call it now, that is at the Ohio Railway Museum in Worthington, Ohio, and it is one of the few remaining examples of early EMC, Electro-Motive Corporation, which is what EMEC, the Electro-Motive Engineering Company, became after its first name change. And that just gives you an idea of what it is. I will go ahead and link that in the description since we weren't able to get it up there for you. But that was a great side door for Mr. Hamilton and Electro-Motive to get involved because, again, they were solving a problem that the railroads could not solve themselves, and also something that the established participants, those large locomotive builders and even the car builders, couldn't solve on their own. But what was really interesting about that is EMEC operated like a lot of defense contractors or non-brand name defense contractors that we see today, in that everything they did was outsourced. The engines, the generators, the trucks, the bodies, the assembly, all of that was outsourced. So basically what they were doing was they went around and they found, for example, General Electric or Brill and a few others who made these parts and said, hey, can we buy this? Can we buy that? Yep, we can. And found somebody to be the contract assembler, basically, put it together and then get it out the door. And that's what ended up selling to the railroads. And that's also why, if you do a deep dive into the history of Electro-Motive, you'll see there are a lot of variations in what was produced early on. Now, EMEC later on became, as I said, Electro-Motive Corporation, and then it was acquired by General Motors. And that is one of the more interesting stories here, because we tend to think of General Motors as being exactly what most of us interacted with, which is this gargantuan automotive manufacturer that built Chevrolet and Pontiac and Buick and Oldsmobile and, of course, Cadillac, their flagship. But what was so interesting was that early on, they had purchased the Winton Engine Company and later on purchased Electro-Motive, and they had a man there named Charles Kettering. And you've probably heard of Charles Kettering, or at least the last name, when you hear Sloan Kettering, the medical center in New York City. And Sloan is Alfred P. Sloan. He was the head of General Motors during this period, perhaps its largest era of growth. And then Charles Kettering was, he came from Delco, which he had put together, and Dayton Engineering Laboratories Company, which had started in 1909, and GM purchased Delco in order to get the talents of Charles Kettering. And he came over, and there was an interesting story about how he had a yacht, and he didn't like the diesel engine on the yacht. He didn't like the way it worked, so he started to experiment with different ways, different injectors and so forth on the diesel engines. And so after the Winton Engine Company was purchased, and then eventually Electro-Motive was purchased because the Winton Engine Company had been one of the suppliers of Electro-Motive's engines, well, Kettering started to tinker with the designs, which we all know as the 201A, or I should say probably one of the newer designs of Winton diesel engines that were used in locomotives, and this is what produced the EMD 567, which stands for 567 cubic inches per cylinder of displacement. The 567 was revolutionary because it was relatively easy to maintain. And also, this was a 2-cycle engine, and that's why if you're ever around any EMD except for the SD70 ACE T4 and you listen to it, it has a distinctive sound that you won't find anywhere else except on a Baldwin, which also have 2-cycle engines. And basically, that means in one cycle you have fuel injected and combustion take place, and the other cycle you have the exhaust gases expelled. So rather than that taking place in 4 separate parts, it only takes place in 2 parts. Most people tend to know 2-cycle engines from lawnmowers and, kind of those smaller, very, very light duty engines. But this was probably the largest application, this and also Baldwin, on locomotives. And so this is really what keyed what I call the first generation of diesel locomotives, and that is what I say stretched from 1939 when the EMD FT, or I should say at that point it was still EMC, Electro-Motive Corporation, even though it was owned by General Motors at the time, and runs through 1963 when the last of the E9s, the EMD, Electro-Motive Division of General Motors, by that point rolled off of the assembly line in LaGrange, Illinois. Now, I'll admit I have a little bit of a bias. I am an EMD fan. Now, I have not had the opportunity to maintain them, so I know for some of you who have worked in the rail industry, you've worked in some of the shop facilities, you've had the honor, or depending on what day it is, difficulty of putting a lot of this stuff together, taking it apart, seeing how difficult it can be to handle a lot of that. But what I liked about EMDs is the same thing that a lot of railroads liked about them. First of all, it was the interchangeability. So when one thinks of the F7, the E8, the GP7, and the BL2, outwardly, you see 4 different locomotives that have 4 different purposes. The E8, of course, which is on the thumbnail of this podcast episode for those who watch on YouTube and Rumble, that is a twin-engine, 2,250 horsepower passenger locomotive that is optimized for pulling passenger trains at high speeds. The F7, and it's 70 feet 3 inches long, slightly shorter, just a little under 55 feet. I think it is 54 feet. No, a little under 54 feet, is the F7. The F7 is a dual service locomotive. It is equally at home on a passenger train as it is a freight train, and railroads use them for both purposes, although its water capacity for steam generator when used in passenger service was a little bit smaller than a lot of railroads wanted, which is what led to the 4-foot longer FP7, where they added additional water tanks to support the steam generator, which supplied heat for the cars and also activated air conditioning for certain railroads, Santa Fe, Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe being one example. Another locomotive that we mentioned there, the GP7, that was a hood unit, which of course could pull passenger trains, but was primarily targeted at road freight trains. It obviously pulled road freight trains in large numbers. You would see braces of 3, 4, and 5 of them working together, but you could also see one GP7 go down a branch line and pick up a few cars from an industry here or there and bring them back to the yard for classification. And then, of course, you have the BL2, which is the hybrid. It sits right there in between the GP7 and the F7, and this was designed to keep some of that full width, or keep a lot of the benefits of the full width body, but improve visibility, which on an F7 or an E8 is quite a bit less. And that's why a lot of people tend to think of those as being the so-called 484 of the diesel locomotive era, in that they were very good at going forward, but not all that great at going any other direction, of course, backward being that. So that gives you an idea. So those are actually 5 locomotives. You can include the FP7 in there. That gives you an idea of the different range of what could be offered. But here's the rub. Each of those locomotives had the same type of diesel engine, the EMD 567B, so the B block, so the third version of the 567s. You have the 567 itself, then the A, B, C, D blocks, so there were different engine blocks that were used, and similar power assemblies in all of them. And then similar traction motors, generators, and control systems. So that meant you could buy all of these items in bulk, and you could pretty much interchange them from locomotive to locomotive. If you've got one that comes in and it has some kind of a mechanical problem and it's going to take quite a bit longer to fix that, you could pull a part off of that and put it on another locomotive that needs some different repair that won't take quite as long. Have that locomotive out on the road while you troubleshoot the one that needs more work. And while you're doing that, you've got a whole storehouse full of parts that are similar. This is what made the locomotives so saleable to the rail industry, who had been accustomed to different classes with different parts, which often were not interchangeable, or not as interchangeable as we realize today. So that's really where the success in the first generation came from, and that's why Electro-Motive, with General Motors backing, became so successful. Another thing, which is quite a bit less impactful from a railroad industry standpoint, but is very impactful from a marketing standpoint, was what Electro-Motive Division did with the paint schemes. Now, we'll link in the description several different locomotives, but I like to think, first of all, your Atlantic Coast Line, the purple, silver, and gold that they are so famous for, that scheme was not only on E units, as we tend to think of it, it was also on GP7s, it was also on F7s, it was just about everywhere. This was a dramatic change from the same railroad that not that much earlier had big black steam engines going up and down the tracks, and then is now something that's just flat black paint, or even glossy black paint, doesn't have the same resonance as a splash of colors like purple, silver, and gold all together. The same goes for the Florida East Coast that we were talking about earlier, when you see the colors that the FEC had on its passenger locomotives. Again, think about as this is coming down the track and you're getting into an era where Americans are very much starting to see nationwide marketing campaigns for national brands. This is the beginning of what we started to see so much more with what we recognize today as our Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, Kellogg's, and so on. And how do those brands get you in? Well, first of all, they create something that is aesthetically pleasing. And EMD, as part of General Motors, and General Motors always having lived and died on the effectiveness of its marketing, was able to bring that to the rail industry. So there again, you had a very staid industry that had immense investment in the way things currently were done. Having this new company, relatively new company, that again was outside of the railroad milieu, coming in and doing a blockbuster change. And that changed things so much for everyone, because now, as a result of what they were doing, you saw the incumbent locomotive builders, and that's Alco, Baldwin, and Lima, rushing to catch up. And of course, we all know the Alco PAs could be just as colorful as the EMD E units, and the same went for the FAs and the RS1s and RS2s and so on. And we know that Baldwin did make a very, very good effort at putting locomotives together, even if they were not anywhere near as successful as EMD and Alco. And by the way, I encourage you to go to South Jersey and take a look at SMS Rail, that continues to utilize Baldwin's in regular service on a daily basis. And so you can get an idea of what that first generation of locomotion was like. And by the way, they also have now a couple of FP7s, which first generation locomotives painted in Reading paint, that will be used on their lines. Their Woodstown Central tourist line that operates out of Woodstown, New Jersey, also in South Jersey. So you can get a little idea of what it was like in the 1940s and into the 1950s, and see that today in one place. So I bring all of this up and I mention all of this because that change is what has really keyed railroading in many ways in the time since. Now, while railroads are still a relatively staid and slow moving industry, and after all, you have to be, because if you have billions and billions of dollars of investment that is tied up into everything from your track to the equipment itself, and a lot of procedures and so forth, you've got to be circumspect as you move forward and make these changes. Because keep in mind, what would have happened to the railroad manager who was an out and out supporter of the diesel locomotive, and rather than having a successful FT 103 barnstorming the nation and proving that diesel locomotion actually could, and by the way, I apologize, it should be diesel electric locomotion. I know. I apologize for that, but I'm just so used to it, as I know are many of us. If it wasn't for FT 103 and having been so well built and so capable, what would have happened to the manager that championed diesel electric locomotion only to find an unreliable locomotive that couldn't compete with steam? He would have been out of a job, and there would have been a lot of suffering from a financial or personal career standpoint that would have gone along with that. So that's really why when we look back at what General Motors is able to accomplish and the folks at Electro-Motive, we've got to be really, really surprised at that. And we owe them a debt of gratitude. Now, just a little more on some of the just interesting aspects of the first generation. Early on, there was a lot of interest as far as the road locomotives were concerned in having the full width body. So that's why when you look at the F units and the E units, you see a lot of that, and why that was so popular. And the full width body does have some benefits, most notably that if you have to get at the machinery at any point while the train is in motion, you're doing so inside the body as opposed to outside the body. There's only one problem. And that is that it's very difficult, as I mentioned earlier, to see alongside the locomotive. And this is critical when we're talking about switching, because as you're going through the process of switching, often you will have the brakeman ride the front of the locomotive, not on a front platform, but on the steps. And now, of course, we talk about steps now because they are required on locomotives that are primarily used in switching services. But when a lot of these full-width locomotives were new, you did have brakemen who would ride on the pilot, which is the section right under the nose at the front of the locomotive, ride there on a grab iron as they're moving from setting out a cut of cars here to picking up a cut of cars there, coupling and uncoupling. And that can be very dangerous because no matter what side the brakeman is riding on, if you look at an F7 or an E unit or otherwise, you'll see that it would be impossible, not virtually, it would be actually impossible for the engineer to see the brakeman and where he is. And that way it would be also impossible to know, did something happen to him? Where is he standing? Where should I be? How can I see the hand signals and so on? So that's what made that so difficult. And so that cut down on the versatility of some of those locomotives. And that's why you went to the hood units. Now, the hood units, which is what we call most of the locomotives today, because you have a hood basically that covers the machinery, and then a hood that is up front, although that front hood has really been replaced with a full width nose that also has a gangplank or a platform in the front where someone can ride while they're switching. So the issue that we were talking about with the first generation locomotives no longer exists. You have the hood units created because now the engineer could see backwards, he could see forward, and he also had an improved ability to look down and see where the brakeman is as he's doing his switching. And that improved versatility because now you could take that same locomotive, as I mentioned earlier, go down a branch line, do switching at a variety of industries that are located there, then bring those cars back, put them in a rail yard, and then switch them there to classify them for an outbound train that's going to come along. And then if you're going to have a road train that leaves from that yard, that same locomotive can now pull that train down the main line. So that was a versatility that started during the first generation, really with the Alco RS1, But also, of course, most of the press does tend to go to EMD and its GP7 and GP9 because that solved the problem of versatility. Another thing that came about during the first generation was, of course, the growth of the passenger locomotive and how those became far more reliable. And for that, we really do have a lot to thank the EMD E-unit. Now, you know me, I love my E-units, so I'm probably going to talk about them a little bit more than necessary, but they were able to operate on not only two engines, but also one. But that reliability gave, because they're twin engine, but that reliability gave the railroads the confidence to say, look, we can dispatch this down the line and we don't have to worry about our train not getting there. And this is in the time when passenger trains were still at the forefront of what railroads did. Even if they weren't quite as profitable, they were still the showpiece, and nobody wanted to be the railroad that was incapable of providing good passenger service, because that most certainly reflected on your ability to provide good freight service. So, I hope you've enjoyed this overview of of first generation locomotives. I am very, very sorry to those of you on CP5 Cam that we weren't able to get the photos up for you. But as I said, we will link several in the description so that you can see a little bit of what we're talking about here. We will be back on Wednesday with our next episode. And as always, if you have any ideas about topics you'd like us to cover, please let me know. And if there's any topic we've already covered that you'd like to see us go a little bit more in depth, please let me know also, because the really cool thing about railroading is that we can talk about one subject for about an hour and still not really scratch the surface. And there'll be plenty of interesting things for folks to get into as time continues to roll on. So thank you so much for being with us here on the All Aboard podcast. We'll see you down the main line, and I hope you have a great day.